The human ship drifted in the endless dark of space, broken and silent, its lights gone, its engines cold, and its crew scattered across the void. Yet one survivor still clung to life, a single human inside a cracked escape pod, breathing shallow gasps, waiting for the end that seemed certain. When shadows of alien vessels moved across the stars, their shapes, strange, their movements quiet, as if watching before deciding whether to let the last human drift to death or to reach out and change the path of fate. The aliens were not known to be merciful. They were not friends of mankind, nor were they enemies. They were strangers from a world never touched by human feet, and they had no reason to help, no reason to care. Yet when they found the fragile pod and saw the weak figure inside, they chose to act. They opened their ship's bay doors and pulled the human inside. They gave warmth and air, they gave water and light, and life returned slowly to the one who thought death was near. The human's heart began to beat stronger again, and hope filled the lungs that once carried only despair. The alien healers worked in silence, their tools glowing with colors no human eyes had seen before. They spoke in low tones, words that meant nothing to human ears, yet their intent was clear. They wanted the human to live. They wanted to preserve a life that was not theirs. They covered wounds, they repaired bones, they used gentle care, until the human opened tired eyes and saw strange faces leaning above, faces with silver skin and luminous eyes, faces that did not belong to Earth, but now were the only reason breath still came. The human could not speak their language, but the message was simple enough. Thank you, the human whispered weakly, and though the words were not understood, the meaning traveled in the way the voice cracked, in the way the eyes looked at them with gratitude. And the aliens paused, as if something inside them shifted. For a long time, they had seen humans only from a distance in battles and encounters filled with fear and fire, but here was one human alone, fragile, vulnerable, and still reaching out with nothing but thanks. News of the rescue spread through their ship. Some asked why risk their own resources for a creature so different, so unpredictable. Others felt it was right to do what was done, for life was precious, no matter its shape, no matter the world it came from. And so they agreed to continue to care until the human was strong enough to stand again. The human learned slowly with gestures and drawings. They shared little things, their name, their planet, their people. They showed pictures kept in a broken device, a family, smiling, a world green and blue. The aliens watched with quiet eyes and began to see humans not as distant figures, but as people with homes and lives and hearts that felt the same as theirs. Days passed, the human grew stronger, the crew grew curious, and a bond formed, fragile yet real. And in that fragile bond lay the spark of something greater, something that would one day echo through the stars. Yet for now, it was only kindness, only mercy, only the choice to save one life when no one else would. What the aliens did not know was that humanity never forgot debts, never ignored acts of mercy. And when the human finally returned to their own people, carrying the story of strangers who saved them, carrying proof of kindness in the dark of space, it would awaken something powerful. It would shape a vow, a promise, that if these aliens ever faced danger, if their world ever cried for help, humanity would not stay silent. Humanity would return, and humanity would come, not for one, not for a few, but for all of them. And so the story began with one broken ship, with one fragile life, saved in the cold dark of space, with one act of mercy that seemed small at the time, but would grow into a storm, into a force that would shake the stars themselves, for they rescued one human. And because of that, humanity would return for their entire world. The human returned to Earth, carried by ships of their own kind, who listened with wide eyes as the survivor spoke of silver-skinned beings with luminous eyes, who gave warmth and water, who healed wounds when death was near. And though many doubted the tale at first, soon the proof came, for the broken pod still bore strange marks etched by alien hands, and the human's body still carried traces of medicine unknown to human science. So doubt began to fade, replaced by curiosity and something more powerful, gratitude. The leaders of Earth gathered to hear the full account, and as the human told their story, the hall grew silent, for here was not an enemy, not a rival, not a conqueror, but a people who chose mercy when they could have turned away. And for humanity, that meant everything, for history had shown humans were not always merciful. Yet when shown kindness, humanity repaid kindness tenfold, and when shown mercy, humanity answered with loyalty stronger than steel. The human begged their leaders to remember these aliens not as strangers, but as allies waiting to be found. And though politics slowed decisions, though arguments filled rooms, with words the truth lingered like fire in every heart. If they saved one of us, then we owe them more than words. We owe them action. We owe them our strength. So missions were planned secret. At first cautious yet determined ships were built not for war, but for return. They would search the stars to find the world of the luminous-eyed beings. And when they did, they would show that humanity remembered humanity, never forgot a debt, and never ignored a hand of mercy in the dark. Meanwhile, on the alien world, life continued as it always had. Cities of light glowing under twin moons, forests of silver leaves whispering with strange wind, seas that shimmered like liquid crystal stretching beyond sight, and people who thought little of the human they once saved for to them. It was a moment, a choice made and forgotten, yet fate had already moved the pieces, and soon they would see what it meant to touch the destiny of humankind. The human who had been saved could not rest. They trained harder, they spoke louder. They carried the story to every corner of Earth. Their voice became fire that spread through the young, through the old, through soldiers and scientists, until the vow became unshakable. They rescued one of us, so we must return for them all. Years passed, ships grew faster, engines burned brighter, weapons were sharpened, not for conquest, but for defense of the universe was not kind. And though humanity wished peace, it knew danger lurked always in the dark, and danger did come before the mission of gratitude could be fulfilled. For a new enemy rose, a species unlike the silver-skinned, allies ruthless and hungry for worlds. They spread like locust devouring systems, leaving ash behind, and their eyes soon turned toward the glowing cities under twin moons. The luminous-eyed people faced the storm alone, their defenses strong, but not endless, their fleets brave, but not vast. They fought with courage, yet the enemy came in waves, and for every ship destroyed, 3 more arrived, and despair began to seep into their hearts, for they had no great allies, no promises of aid, only the fading strength of their own kind. But word of their struggle reached human ears through scattered signals caught by explorers, through whispers and deep space relays. And when humanity learned who it was who suffered, when they learned that the ones under attack were the same who once saved one broken soul, humanity rose as one voice that shook the stars. For now was the time to keep the vow, now was the time to repay the debt. The human who had been saved stood again before the leaders, their eyes burning with unshakable fire, saying, "They gave me life when no one else would. They saved me when even I had given up. Now their whole world calls for help, and if we do not answer, then we're no longer worthy of being called human." The halls that once argued now fell silent. The decisions that once crawled now moved like lightning. Fleets were summoned, engines roared, the skies of Earth filled with fire as humanity prepared to leave, not with one ship, not with a few, but with an armada, a storm of steel and light, carrying the promise made years ago, carrying the spirit of every human who believed in mercy, who believed in honor, who believed in never forgetting a hand that once saved a life. And as the ships rose from Earth, carrying banners of blue and white, the human who had been rescued stood among them, not as a victim, but as a guide, as a voice that carried the memory of silver eyes and gentle hands. And in their heart burned a vow that nothing would stop them, not fear, not distance, not war, for they were coming. And when humanity came, they would not come for one, they would come for all. So the journey began across the void, engines screaming through the darkness as fleets of humans carved a path toward the twin moons, and the glowing seas, the stars themselves, seemed to watch as destiny unfolded. For this was no longer the story of one human lost and saved. This was the story of 2 peoples bound by mercy, bound by promise, and about to face a storm that would test them both. For they rescued one human, and now humanity was bringing the strength of an entire world to return the gift. The fleet of humanity moved across the endless night of space like a living wave of steel and fire, engines blazing with the power of Earth's greatest forges, weapons humming with silent energy, shields glowing faint blue against the starlight. And inside those ships beat the hearts of men and women who carried the vow of their kind. They remembered the story of mercy. They remembered the one who had been saved. And in their minds the mission was simple. They would not fail. They would not turn back. They would not allow the kind who saved one of them to fall into the jaws of merciless invaders. The journey through the void was long, yet no one faltered, for unity bound them stronger than fear. And when the twin moons of the alien world finally rose on their screens, shining like guardians above a blue and silver planet, the silence across the fleet was heavy with awe, for here was the home they had promised to protect, the place of luminous-eyed beings who had given life to a dying human and now stood in danger of losing their own. But the skies of that world were not calm. They burned with fire. Ships clashed above the shining seas. Explosions rolled through the dark as the enemy swarmed in endless numbers. Sleek vessels shaped like blades cutting across the stars, leaving trails of flame in their wake. And against them the defenders fought with courage, their silver ships agile and sharp, glowing with strange light as they struck again and again, yet every strike was answered by many more, and the line of defense grew thinner with each passing moment. The human fleet did not hesitate. They entered the battle like thunder. Their arrival, shaking the void with sudden force, signals flashed across channels, orders roared through every vessel, and soon the black sky was filled with a storm of humanities, while missiles streaked like burning spears, lasers cut like rivers of fire, kinetic rounds tore through the dark as if the stars themselves had turned into weapons. And for the first time the enemy faltered, for they had not expected such a storm. They had not expected a new people to rise from the shadows of space and strike with fury. The defenders of the twin moon world saw the arrival with wide, luminous eyes. They had thought the fight was ending. They had thought their world would fall. But now hope returned like a flood, for out of the endless night came ships they had never seen before, painted with strange symbols, carrying a force they could not understand, and yet fighting for them side by side. And in that moment, the promise once spoken by one fragile human began to take shape in fire and light. Inside one of the leading ships stood the human who had been saved long ago, no longer weak, no longer broken, now strong and steady, dressed in the uniform of command, their eyes fixed on the battle, their voice steady as they gave orders to strike, to shield, to protect the world that once gave them mercy. And every soldier who heard that voice carried the same fire inside, for this was not only war, this was honor, this was debt repaid. The battle raged on the enemy, swarming in endless waves, their hunger for destruction unbroken, yet humanity's fleet pushed harder, faster, with unity stronger than iron. They fought not only with weapons, but with purpose, and purpose can be sharper than any blade. Missiles shattered enemy lines, cannons tore apart the wings of dark invaders, while human ships shielded the defenders with walls of fire. And for every vessel that burned, three more rose to take its place. The enemy screamed across channels in voices unknown, cruel and harsh, yet even their rage began to waver, for humanity did not break, humanity did not scatter. They fought like a storm that only grew with time, and soon the black skies of the twin moons were no longer filled with despair, but with fire that burned with hope. Still the battle was not won. The enemy was vast, their numbers stretching beyond sight, their hunger endless. And though the arrival of humanity had turned the tide, the war was far from over. Ships fell from the sky, torn apart, bodies floated into the dark as silent reminders of sacrifice. Yet the vow held, the fleet pressed forward, the defenders rallied behind them. The enemy was forced to retreat from the immediate skies, though only for a moment, for their strength was not broken, only delayed. On the ground below, the luminous-eyed people lifted their gaze, watching the fire above, the endless clash of ships streaking across their heavens. And for the first time, they whispered of humans not as strangers, but as saviors. They remembered the one they had rescued long ago, and now they saw an entire world returning to repay that choice. And though fear still clung to their hearts, it was joined by something greater. It was joined by hope. When the battle paused, when silence fell for a short breath, the leaders of humanity spoke across the channels to the leaders of the silver-skinned beings, their message simple and clear: we remember your mercy, we remember your kindness, and we're here not for conquest, not for control, but to stand with you until the enemy is gone, until your world is safe. And though the two peoples spoke with different tongues, though words had to be shaped into meaning by machines, the truth carried deeper than language, for both sides knew this bond was real, born for mercy, sealed in battle and destined to change the stars. Yet even as they shared this moment of unity, warnings echoed through the human fleet. Scouts reported more enemy vessels moving from the dark, greater in number, greater in fire, greater in hunger. The first wave had only been the beginning. The true storm was yet to come, and both peoples knew the fight ahead would not be short. It would not be easy. It would test the vow. It would test the strength of humanity. It would test the will of those who once saved one fragile life and now stood beside billions. The silence before the next clash hung heavy across both fleets. Men and women gripped their stations. Luminous-eyed warriors steadied their hands, and the human who had once been saved whispered to themselves a vow not spoken to others, but burning inside. If they want to destroy this world, they will have to go through us all, and we will not break. So the stars waited. The enemy gathered. The fleets of two people stood side by side, bound not by treaties, not by ancient pacts, but by one act of mercy that grew into a storm that would soon decide the fate of worlds. For they rescued one human, and humanity had returned, not with thanks spoken in words, but with fire and steel, and the promise that they would stand until the very end. The silence before the storm ended as the black of space began to glow with strange red light. Thousands of enemy vessels emerging from the void, their shapes twisted like blades, their engines burning with hunger, their numbers so vast that even the stars seemed to vanish behind them. And across the human fleet and the ships of the luminous-eyed people, every heart tightened with the weight of what was coming. The first battle had been fierce, yet small compared to this wave, and now both allies knew the truth. The real war had only just begun, and the enemy was no longer simply testing. They were coming to erase, to consume, to tear apart everything that lived under the twin moons, and to make the seas of crystal and the forests of silver nothing more than ash drifting in the void. Inside the command vessel of humanity, the one who had been saved years ago stood steady, their hands gripping the edge of the console, their eyes burning with fire. They remembered the cold silence of the escape pod, the moment when life had nearly ended and the hands of strangers reached out to save them. And they swore again in their heart that no matter how great this storm became, humanity would not turn away, humanity would not break. Across the channel, the leaders of the luminous-eyed people spoke, their voices calm, yet heavy with fear and resolve. They thanked humanity for standing with them, and they warned that the enemy never stopped. Once they began, never showed mercy, never turned aside, until all was gone. And though humanity listened, their answer was simple: we are here, we will fight, we will not leave. The wave of enemy vessels surged forward like a tide of fire, crashing into the defenses around the twin moons, and the battle began again. With a fury greater than before, human ships roared into formation, shields raised, weapons blazing, missiles cut through the black like falling stars, lasers carved red rivers across the void, kinetic rounds thundered into enemy armor, tearing ships apart, while the silver-skinned allies darted through the chaos there. Vessels quick and sharp, striking like blades of light and retreating before the enemy could close. But the enemy came in endless waves, their ships striking without fear, without hesitation, like predators who felt no pain and no doubt. They sacrificed their own kind by the hundreds, by the thousands, just to break through the lines. And every time one vessel fell, two more filled its place, and the sky above the world became a sea of burning wreckage. Human voices rang out through the comms, steady yet fierce, pilots shouting warnings, gunners crying targets, captains commanding their crews to hold steady, engineers struggling to keep engines alive, medics working without rest to save those who were wounded. Every soul inside the fleet knew this was more than battle. This was survival. This was the defense of a promise. The one who had been saved took command, not only of their ship, but of the unity between the fleets. They spoke across channels, guiding human squadrons to shield their allies, guiding silver-skinned wings to strike where human fire opened paths. And together, the two peoples began to fight as one, not separate forces, but one storm woven of mercy and fire. Still the cost was heavy. Ships broke apart, bodies were lost into the endless night, explosions painted the skies red and blue, whole squadrons vanished under the crushing wave of enemy fire. Yet even in loss, humanity did not falter. They pressed harder, they burned brighter. They were stronger than fear, for they carried not only their own fate, but the fate of those who once chose kindness when no one else would. On the ground below, the luminous-eyed people watched their skies burn. They gathered in cities, they prayed. Under the twin moons, they held their children close and whispered that they were not alone, that the strangers from Earth were fighting for them, that the fire above was not only destruction, but also protection, and for the first time in generations, they felt what it meant to hope. Hours turned into days as the battle stretched unbroken, the fleets, moving in endless patterns of strike and shield push and retreat, the void littered with wreckage, yet still alive with fire, and through it all the vow held humanity, never left the line, never abandoned their allies. And with each passing hour the bond grew stronger, sealed, not by words, but by blood and sacrifice. Yet the enemy did not tire. They sent more ships from the black, more weapons, more fire, more hunger, until even the strongest began to feel the weight, until the engines of the human fleet screamed from strain, until the luminous-eyed warriors began to doubt whether the storm could ever be stopped. And in that moment of weakness, the enemy struck harder than ever, breaking through the lines, tearing apart defenses, driving deep toward the heart of the world. The one who had been saved saw it, saw the opening that could mean the fall of the world, saw the wave of enemy vessels racing down, and they made the choice, without hesitation, calling every ship within reach, ordering them to follow into a charge straight into the teeth of the storm. And though fear touched every soul, they obeyed, for they trusted the voice that carried the memory of mercy. Together they crashed into the enemy line, engines, burning shields, flaring weapons, screaming with every ounce of power left, and the void exploded in fire so bright that even the twin moons shone like day. The charge cut deep, breaking apart the wave for a moment, turning the tide, just long enough for the defenders to regroup, just long enough for hope to flare again. But the battle was far from over. The enemy still came, their numbers unbroken, their hunger endless. And though humanity had bought time, it was only time, nothing more, and everyone knew the fight would continue until either the world fell or the storm itself was broken. And so they held the line together, two peoples bound by one act of mercy, now bound by fire and by the vow that they would not break, not today, not ever, for they had rescued one human, and in return humanity had come with all the fury and all the fire of an entire world, ready to stand until the very end. The skies above the twin moons burned without pause, wreckage floating like black rain across the void, flames tearing across the night as ships shattered into pieces, and the cries of soldiers echoed through the channels. Every battle scar showed how much had already been given, yet the storm of enemies did not, and only grew stronger, and the weight of survival pressed heavy on both fleets. Human captains pushed their crews to limits, engines strained until they roared with heat, weapons fired until barrels glowed, bright red shields flickered under endless impacts. But still the line held, because the vow held. They remembered why they came, they remembered the fragile act of mercy years ago, and they swore no matter how many fell, they would not let this world be swallowed. The silver-skinned defenders matched their fire, their ships weaving like streaks of light between human vessels, their voices chanting in calm tones that steadied their warriors, their movements graceful even in chaos. But even their strength began to waver as enemy waves crashed harder, faster, never stopping, never giving breath. And for every enemy ship destroyed, 10 more seemed to rise from the darkness. On the ground, the people of the twin moons gathered in temples and towers, lifting their luminous eyes to the heavens, watching as fire streaked across the skies. They saw their protectors burn. They saw strangers from another world bleed for them. And their hearts broke, yet their hearts also grew stronger, because they understood for the first time they were not alone in the universe, and that truth gave them strength to endure. Inside the flagship of humanity, the one who had been saved long ago stood in silence, listening to reports, each word heavy with sacrifice, each voice marked with strain, yet their eyes never wavered. They carried the memory of their own rescue, the moment when death had been near and silver hands pulled them back into life, and they carried the promise that such mercy would never be forgotten, so they gave orders not only to fight, but to shield their allies too. Make sure the defenders did not fall. Because this war was not only for survival, it was for honor. But the enemy was clever. They shifted their attack patterns, cutting into weak points, isolating human squadrons, swarming defenders that strayed too far from formation, like wolves tearing apart prey. They sacrificed their own ships, without hesitation crashing into shields, exploding in flashes of fire to break open the line, and each time the humans and their allies closed the gap, another strike tore somewhere new. Losses grew heavier, names vanished from the channel's silence, replacing voices that had once laughed and shouted with courage, and yet every loss only made the survivors fight harder, because to fall now would mean the end, not only for one world, but for the bond that tied them together. Days blurred into nights, though in space such things had no meaning. Still the warriors felt time stretch and crush them, exhaustion creeping into every mind, every muscle, every soul. Yet they refused to rest, they refused to surrender, they refused to let the skies fall, because the vow was greater than fear, greater than pain. Then the enemy changed the storm, shifted. A massive vessel emerged from the void, larger than mountains, shaped like a black fortress, its engines burning with fire that looked like blood, its weapons glowing with a light that promised ruin. And when it appeared, silence swept across the human fleet, silence swept across the defenders, because they all knew this was the heart of the storm, this was the beast that led the swarm. The great vessel moved slow, but every strike it fired tore through fleets like knives, through paper shields, shattered ships, burned whole squadrons, erased in single blasts. And for the first time, doubt whispered through the hearts of the defenders, for how could they fight something so vast, so merciless, so unbroken? The one who had been saved stared at the beast, their jaw tight, their voice steady. They spoke across the comms, telling every soul to hear that no fortress, no storm, no beast could make humanity turn away. They reminded them that once a single fragile human had been given life by mercy, and because of that one act, an entire world now stood to fight, and that vow was stronger than any enemy. So humanity prepared a plan, not of retreat, not of surrender, but of defiance. They would strike the fortress at its heart. They would not wait for death to come. They would carry the battle to the core of the beast, and they would carve hope out of fire. The plan spread through the fleet. Ships began to shift into new formations, shields, overlapping weapons, focused gunners loading their heaviest rounds, engineers feeding every spark of energy into engines, commanders calling for unity, stronger than fear, and the defenders of the twin moons answered the call, weaving their ships beside human squadrons ready to strike together as one. The charge began, engines roaring, fire blazing across the skies. The human fleet led the way, silver ships close at their side, and together they cut through enemy waves, ignoring the fire tearing at their shields, ignoring the explosions bursting around them, focusing only on the dark fortress looming ahead like a mountain of death in the void. Enemy ships swarmed to block them, claws of fire and steel slashing at their path. But the fleet pressed on, missiles exploding in waves, lasers burning holes through enemy wings, kinetic rounds blasting apart the swarm with thunder. Each sacrifice another step closer, each voice silenced, another stone laid on the path forward. And though the cost was heavy, the will was unbroken. The defenders on the ground looked up and saw it, the charge of two peoples bound by promise, streaking through the skies. And though they could not touch the battle, they raised their voices in chants, their hands lifted, their eyes shining with tears, because they understood they were watching history, they were watching a bond sealed in blood and fire. The fortress loomed larger, weapons glowing brighter, shields pulsing like waves of night, and still the fleet pressed forward, the vow carrying them. When strength faltered, unity carrying them. When fear whispered, because this was more than war, this was the answer to mercy. This was humanity, showing that one life saved could bring the fire of an entire world. And as the charge thundered closer, as the fortress filled their vision, every heart knew the moment of truth was coming, the moment where sacrifice and hope would clash, the moment where the vow would be tested in fire, and the fate of both peoples would hang on the edge of the storm. For they rescued one human, and now humanity carried the weight of that choice straight into the heart of the beast. The fortress filled the skies like a mountain of darkness, its armored walls glowing with rivers of fire, its cannons burning with light so fierce that each strike ripped through the void like the hand of a god. And around it the swarm of enemy ships circled like predators, protecting their master, their endless numbers pressing against the charge of humanity and their silver-eyed allies. Yet the vow carried the fleet forward, engines screaming, shields burning, but still they pressed on, because this was the moment where the promise had to be kept. The human who had once been saved stood at the center of the flagship, their voice calm, yet fierce, giving orders to every ship, guiding formations, directing fire, holding the line together. With will stronger than steel, they reminded every soul of why they were here. They spoke of mercy, they spoke of honor, they spoke of a bond made when one fragile life had been lifted from death, and in their words, the fleet found strength when hope began to fade. The fortress opened fire again, its cannons unleashing storms of energy that tore apart entire squadrons. Human ships burned defenders, shattered silver hulls, broke into glowing fragments. Yet every time a vessel fell, others filled the gap, refusing to break, refusing to give ground, because they knew retreat was death, and they knew the promise was worth more than fear. The charge drew. Closer missiles struck at the fortress shields, but the blasts only rippled across its armor, leaving no true wound. Lasers carved against the walls, yet the light bent away. Kinetic rounds slammed against the surface, but only sparks flew, and the crews began to realize the truth. The beast was not only vast, it was nearly invulnerable. Despair whispered through the channels, yet the one who had been saved silenced it. They ordered scouts to search for weakness, for cracks, for patterns in the shield, and the defenders lent their strange sensors, their knowledge of energy flows, and together they found at a point near the core, where the fortress gathered its power, a place hidden deep, but not unreachable, a place that could be struck if the fleet was willing to pay the price. The plan spread quickly through the ships. They would focus every weapon on that single point. They would carve a path through the swarm. They would unleash all their fire together. And they would not stop until the shield broke and the core was exposed. And though every warrior knew it might cost their lives, none turned away, because this was more than battle, it was destiny. So the fleet shifted into formation, ships locking shields, overlapping fields of energy, weaving a wall of light that burned against the storm. Human vessels at the front, silver ships darting around their sides, striking at weak spots, cutting down enemies that drew too near, and together they moved as one toward the heart of the beast. The enemy responded with fury, waves crashing against the formation ships, exploding under the sheer weight of fire, bodies hurled into the endless night. Yet still the formation held, shields blazing brighter with every strike, gunners firing until their arms shook, engineers pouring every drop of power into reactors, pilots guiding their ships through chaos so thick it seemed impossible to survive, and still the fleet pressed on. Then came the moment. The order rang across every channel, fire everything, and the skies lit up with the fury of two peoples as missiles, lasers, and cannons poured into the single point of weakness. The fortress shield rippled, bending, twisting, fighting to hold, but the storm of fire grew stronger and stronger, until finally, with a soundless scream across the void, the shield cracked, the core of the beast glowing like a black sun, exposed for the first time. Cheers rang out across the channels, but they were cut short as the fortress answered, its cannons glowing brighter than ever, unleashing a wave of destruction that tore through human lines, ripping ships apart by the dozens, breaking formations, shattering shields. The price had come, and it was heavy, but even as flames consumed their vessels, the survivors did not turn. They pressed harder, firing again and again at the exposed core, refusing to let the chance slip away. The luminous-eyed defenders sang in their strange voices, guiding their ships in a sacrificial dives, ramming into enemy wings to clear paths for human gunners. Their songs filled the channels, haunting and beautiful, even as their vessels shattered into light, and humanity answered with fire, throwing every weapon, every ounce of fury into the burning core, until cracks began to spread across the fortress itself. Inside the flagship, the one who had been saved gave the final order to unleash the last, reserve the weapons meant to be used only in desperation, torpedoes armed with the strongest warheads humanity had ever built, and as they launched, the fleet watched them streak across the void, shining like meteors and striking into the cracks of the beast. The core pulsed once, twice, then exploded with a roar that shook the stars. The fortress erupted in light, tearing itself apart in waves of fire. Enemy ships caught in the blast, shattering into dust, the swarm breaking into chaos as their master fell, their endless hunger silenced by the death of their heart, and across the skies of the twin moons the storm that had seemed endless was broken. Silence fell for a moment, only the wreckage drifting, only the soft glow of fires across the void, and then the channels filled with voices cheering, crying, shouting the names of those who had fallen, singing the songs of victory and of sorrow, for the cost had been great, but the vow had been kept. The luminous-eyed people lifted their gaze to the heavens, tears shining in their silver eyes as they saw the storm fade. They whispered of humans not as strangers, not as wanderers, but as brothers and sisters bound to them by fire and mercy, and they swore they would never forget. The human who had been saved stood on the bridge, their body weary, their heart heavy with loss, yet burning with pride, because they knew the vow had been fulfilled. They looked to the stars where the wreckage of the fortress drifted and whispered quietly, "They saved me once, and now we have saved them all." But even as the cheers rose, even as hope filled the hearts of billions, reports came, whispers from the edges of the void, warnings that the war was not finished, that the enemy had other fortresses, other swarms waiting in the dark. And though the skies above the twin moons were safe for now, the battle for survival had only just begun. And so the fleet began to gather again, wounded yet unbroken, scarred, yet unyielding, ready for whatever storm came next, because mercy had bound them and fire had sealed them, and now nothing in the universe could break that bond. For they rescued one human, and humanity had returned not only to save their world, but to fight for a future where mercy was never forgotten. The skies above the twin moons glowed with the fading fire of the fallen fortress, the wreckage drifting in silence like ashes upon the wind. The battlefield was quiet now, yet beneath that quiet lay the voices of countless souls, voices that whispered of sorrow and lost, voices that sang of victory and hope. The fleet floated among the remains, scarred and broken, yet still alive and still burning with purpose. On the bridge of the flagship, the one who had once been saved stood in silence, their gaze fixed on the wreckage. They felt the weight of the battle heavy upon their shoulders, for so many had been lost, yet so many had been saved, and though grief pressed against their heart, they knew that this was what the vow had demanded. This was what it meant to return, not for one, but for all. Messages came from across the fleet, captains reporting heavy losses, engineers speaking of shattered reactors, medics crying out for supplies to heal the wounded, pilots whispering of fallen friends. Yet each message ended the same, with pride, with thanks, with the words, "We held the line, and we kept the vow," and those words carried through every channel like a flame refusing to die. The luminous-eyed defenders sent their own voices across the channels. Their strange songs filled the void, haunting and beautiful, speaking of honor and gratitude. They spoke of humanity not as strangers, but as kin. They spoke of the bond forged in fire and mercy. They declared that their people would remember this day forever, and that the story would be sung for generations to come. The fleet gathered near the twin moons to rest, and repair crews worked day and night, patching torn hulls, sealing broken decks, dragging the wounded from shattered corridors. Ships that had been crippled were tethered to stronger vessels so they could be carried home, and through it all the survivors moved with quiet determination, for they knew that this was not the end, this was only the beginning. The human who had once been saved walked among the wounded, their presence a reminder of why the fleet had fought. They spoke to each survivor. They offered words of comfort and strength. They listened to the grief of those who had lost friends, and they promised that none would be forgotten. And as they moved through the ships, the people felt their spirit grow lighter, their grief softened by the knowledge that they had stood for something greater than themselves. Ceremonies were held across the fleet. Bodies of the fallen were released into the void, wrapped in banners of light, their names spoken aloud, so that no soul would vanish into silence without being remembered. The luminous-eyed defenders sang their songs of farewell, weaving voices with humans who spoke in simple words of love and courage, and together their voices rose like a great choir, filling the stars with sorrow and beauty and unity. Yet even as they mourned, scouts returned from the far edges of the void, their reports heavy with warning. The enemy had not been destroyed entirely, the fortress had fallen, but others remained deeper in the dark, greater in size and strength than the one they had faced, and the swarm, though broken here, still gathered in other regions, hungrier than ever, and it became clear that the war was not over, the war was only beginning. The leaders of both peoples gathered in council aboard the flagship, their faces weary, yet their eyes burning with resolve. They spoke of the cost they had paid, they spoke of the strength they had found together, they spoke of the vow that had bound them, and they swore that they would not rest until the enemy was defeated, not for one world, not for one people, but for all who might one day stand in the shadow of the swarm. Plans were made, fleets would be rebuilt, alliances, strengthened weapons, forged stronger than ever before, training would be shared, knowledge, exchange, humanity, teaching courage, and will the defenders teaching wisdom and vision, and together they would stand not as two, but as one, united by mercy, sealed by fire. The one who had been saved spoke last, their voice quiet, yet filled with unshakable strength. They reminded the council of the moment when their life had been spared, of how one act of compassion had rippled outward until it changed the fate of two entire peoples. They said that mercy was the greatest weapon they had ever known, for it forged bonds stronger than steel and gave reason to fight when strength alone was not enough. And in those words, every leader, every captain, every warrior found their hearts lifted. As the council ended, the fleet began to move. Once more, engines burning with fresh fire. Though scarred, they would not hide. Though wounded, they would not yield. Instead, they would carry their vow across the stars. Wherever the shadow of the swarm reached, their humanity and their allies would rise together. Among the people of the twin moons, joy and sorrow mingled. Families wept for the fallen, yet held their children close with new hope, knowing that they had not been abandoned, knowing that humanity had returned, not only to save, but to stand beside them forever. Fires were lit across their city, songs were sung across their valleys, their silver eyes turned to the heavens, where the fleet shimmered like a constellation of guardians, and they whispered the name of humanity with reverence and love. On the flagship, the one who had been saved stood once more at the great window, staring into the void. They thought of the fallen, they thought of the battles yet to come, they thought of the vow that had been kept, and the vow that still remained. And though the darkness ahead was vast and filled with danger, their heart did not waver, for they knew that no shadow could ever overcome the light that mercy had sparked. The fleet stretched out before them, 1,000 lights glowing against the endless night, some dim, some bright, yet all moving forward together. And in that sight lay a promise that humanity would never turn away, never forget, never surrender. And so the story closed, not with the silence of defeat, but with the echo of voices united across the stars, a story born from mercy, grown in fire, carried by sacrifice, and sealed with unbreakable resolve. For they rescued one human, and humanity came back, not only for their world, but for every world that would ever need them. And this was only the beginning of a legend that would never fade.